Do you have something to say? Are there people who want or need to hear from you? Have you always wanted to start a podcast but don't know where to start? Welcome to Resonate Media, where our mission is to amplify you. At Resonate Media, we focus on helping underrepresented voices and aspiring podcasters get started by providing equipment, expertise, and experience to help you launch a podcast. To get started, visit ResonateMediaPro.com. Don't let the confusion, complications, and costs of hosting, recording, editing, and distribution hold you back. The world needs to hear what you have to say. Resonate Media can help your voice be heard.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to All Things Episcopal, where we talk about anything and everything related to the Episcopal Church. This podcast was designed with younger folks in mind and as a space to learn more about the Christian faith with the Episcopal lens. So in traditionally Episcopalian greeting fashion, the Lord be with you. Well, hello, everybody. It is good to have you back with us to listen to yet another episode of All Things Episcopal. And today I am very excited to have a guest speaker with us who is a former professor of mine and graciously accepted to come onto the podcast today and spend a little bit of time with us. Today we have Clare on the recording with us, and the esteemed Reverend Dr. Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here.
Thank you for being here with us. And just to give everybody a little bit of background on our guest today, the Reverend Dr. Dan Joslyn-Siemiatkoski is the Kraft Family Professor and Director of the Center for Christian Jewish Learning at Boston College. He is a scholar of Jewish-Christian relations, comparative theology, and Anglicanism. He serves at Christ Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and is the Ecumenical and Interreligious Relations Co-Officer for the Episcopal Diocese of Massachusetts. Prior to Boston College, he taught church history at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas, and Church Divinity School of the Pacific in Berkeley, California. Today, Dan has agreed to participate in a bit of an Ask Me Anything episode with you all today, and we have pulled some questions from you, the listeners, and a little bit from your host's very chaotic brains. So we are very excited to begin, and I think we'll just start right off the top here with Dan. Why is it important that we take a step back and understand our roots and our history as Christians within this great Christian tradition?
Right. Well, first of all, it's great to be with you all. Thanks for having me here. I think one of the core things is that Christianity is about story and relationship. And if we keep our connection just in our present generation, or maybe where our parents or grandparents told us, we don't have the full sense of who we are or where we've been from. I think there's also the sense that this is an experience I had a lot when teaching church history in seminary. People simply saying, how come no one ever told me that? Or that's the first time that's been explained to me. Or why couldn't we just have been taught all this sooner? So I think there's also a sense that people know there's something bigger than what's their immediate experience of the church. And having people know the deeper story is actually, I think, very liberating. It allows you to ask more questions. It sets you free to dig deeper. And it's also a way of signaling to us in our present time that it's not all about us and not all about our brand of Christianity.
It's not all about us. That's probably hard for some of us to hear sometimes.
Yes.
You named a little, you started to name with your experiences from teaching in seminary settings, some challenges. And that begs a question of what's the most challenging part of being a scholar in this area right now?
There's just too much to actually master. So the history of Christianity is 2,000 years. It's across dozens of languages, if not hundreds, multiple cultural locations, with branches of events. There's different ways of thinking about intellectually or theologically, institutionally, culturally, lived religion. There's texts, there's artifacts, there's images. So there's all these different forms of knowing. So simply getting your arms around it. And one of the problems of teaching in seminary is often the church history professor is a solo gig. There's one church history professor who has to do it all. Whereas somehow in the Bible area, they get away with getting two people to teach two parts of a book. And we actually have to know quite a bit. So I think just keeping on top of the scholarship, there's just new stuff always coming out, new ways of reading, new texts have been translated, new archaeological finds, new aspects of material culture opening up. And just staying on top of all the diversity of Christian life is a real challenge.
So you speak of diversity that's coming forward in the life of of Christianity and the history that is brought forward to all of us. What's the most exciting thing out there right now? What's the most exciting recent discoveries, or what's on the precipice of being the next big thing?
Yeah. Two areas. Let me do something ancient and something modern. So ancient stuff, the really interesting field that's opened up really over the past decade, 2 decades, has been the history of Christianity to the east of the Mediterranean. So the Church of the East, as it's known, which was a church that was centered in Baghdad, that stretched geographically from essentially ancient Mesopotamia. It had missionary outposts all the way to the Chinese capital of Qian in the ancient world, spreads down into southern India. Christianity seems to get to Tibet before Buddhism does. And that's just a whole fascinating region of scholarship. Their language was Syriac, which was a further dialect of Aramaic. And so often people talk about Syriac Christianity or Syriac studies as just continuing to be fascinating. And part of what's fascinating is it's an ancient form of Christianity that was a minority that dealt with not just cultural diversity, but religious diversity, as in encounters Buddhism, Islam, Taoism, and so there's all these fascinating artifacts of how they engage with that. On the modern end, it's probably what used to be called like missionary history, where all these different missionaries who get sent out from Western countries, Christian countries, to various parts of the globe, it can read as a very kind of colonial enterprise. But these missionaries create these archives. It has bulletins and journals and records of other encounters. And scholars have started to read against the grain of those encounters to see the indigenous experience of the encounter with Christianity, and often how indigenous people navigated and made Christianity their own. So there's a deeper appreciation of, say, in Africa, what's called African initiated churches, the African churches that made Christianity their own and have become their kind of own global movement as a result.
Earlier, you had mentioned artifacts within ancient church history. Other than the Holy Bible, what specific written sources do we have for the earliest days of the church? And do we actually use them in contemporary settings, and for what purpose and in what context?
So probably the most fascinating one is a document called the Didache, or the Teaching of the 12 Apostles, which we'd had the name of for a very long time, but was lost until about the middle of the 19th century when a manuscript of it was discovered in an archive in Italy, I believe. And the Didache narrates kind of an ancient manual, essentially, of how to run church. It seems to be from the region of Syria. It maybe is within what we call a Jewish Jesus-believing context. It lays out a very early form of the Eucharist. It shows bishops as once form authority, but also wandering prophets and teachers as another form of teaching and authority. So it gives us a flash insight into the Christian tradition as it was developing. And scholars have a range of dating from it. Some scholars date it really early, like 90 of the Common Era, which would make it contemporaneous with like John, or into like the year like 150. So there's about a 60-year range, but it's contemporaneous, we could say, with like some of the late New Testament texts, like the Book of Revelation or 3rd John or some of these other texts that we know are a little bit later. And it was used a lot in what was called the liturgical renewal movement in the 20th century. When scholars are trying to figure out, okay, one of the ways that we can all be unified, whether we're Protestant or Catholic, is we can like look to early forms of Christian worship as like a source of commonality before all the divisions emerged. So the Didache became really important as a base text for thinking through some of that. Some of our other early texts are letters from, say, Polycarp, Clement of Alexandria, who are very early church leaders and say period about 110, 120. And those texts have been preserved more or less continuously through Christian history and so are used as kind of touch points for seeing how early Christian teaching emerges.
You had mentioned the apostles.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you think one of the original 12 apostles had more influence over the early life of the church, and which one it might be, and are they a holy troublemaker in the
Right.
sense of creating a little ruffling of feathers?
Yeah, it's sort of tricky to figure out. So I think one of the things that's important to think about with early Christianity is how diverse it was. People go out and spread the Christian message, and if you read like early Christian texts really carefully, like Paul, Paul goes to like Corinth and he's like, "Well, who baptized you?" And he's like, "It wasn't me." And then you're all of a sudden you're thinking, "Wait, someone else was there before Paul." And he names various people who do baptizing. And so we can see early on, if like we accept like the oldest Christian text we probably have is First Thessalonians, maybe written in like about 55, 53, something like that. And it's already an argument. It's already like the first text is Paul trying to settle an argument, a debate in the community in Thessaloniki. So that tells me that from early on, Christianity is like widely diverse and people already have debates and disagreements. And so one of the things that's useful to think about is like different apostolic communities. There's people who form around the identity of Peter, people who form around the identity of Paul or John or Matthew. And that's what gives rise to things like these various gospels named after these various apostles, for instance. Like they have the memory of that apostle. So I think Peter is really important for the Jerusalem church. John seems to be important in places like Ephesus. Paul clearly is important in the various communities he goes to. And so one of the things to think about is not like one has more authority than the other, although our thinking often comes down to a contrast between, say, Peter and Paul. But that there's these different communities all having kind of their own particular window on what it means to be a follower of Jesus at that time. And so the story of early Christianity is people trying to come to a common mind with their various perspectives.
Oh, I'm so glad you said trying to come to a common mind, because that's just a great segue, because as the church does find itself growing both, in people, but also across the span of the known globe, right? Like this in geography, the church is exploding. How does it maintain its unity in the ancient church?
Yeah. Yeah. So the story of early Christianity is this like quest for unity. This ideal of some kind of being cohering together in Christ. I think the metaphor of the body of Christ is a really powerful one in early Christianity. Not all Christians thought that unity look the same? So we have different traditions with different ways of emphasizing the focus of unity. So we have traditions like, and so we can have this come down to different kind of teaching traditions. So one that comes out is what we call the Gnostic movement, which is based on initiates receiving deeper secret teachings of Jesus that their teachers passed on. And then what we could call the Catholic movement. And Catholic here means universal. And I would add the qualifier public. That is that there's a public proclamation that everyone has access to, and that no one has secret knowledge. There's no hierarchy of believers. But bishops emerge in the Catholic movement as symbols of the teaching preserved by Jesus. And so we really have these differing networks of how unity is achieved. And the one that comes to predominate is this Catholic movement that focuses on the teaching authority of bishops as a way of ensuring that there's a consistent, clear public teaching of the gospel. And then that evolves into different bishops have differing relationships, and that moves into things like church councils, where groups of bishops from various regions get together to come to a common mind over bigger issues and problems and debates.
Because this is the All Things Episcopal podcast, I want to focus a little bit more on how we maintain the unity of the Episcopal Church within the broader globe of the Anglican Communion. So every so often we hear that the Episcopal Church is part of the Anglican Communion. What exactly does that mean, and how does that impact our governance in our churches and broader faith community?
Yeah, that's a big question. That kind of moves us forward, and we probably also have to go backward again to get some of that rooting. But yeah, so Episcopal it's a weird thing, kind of church to be called the Episcopal Church, because an adjective is our primary identifier. So we are a church founded around the authority of bishops. Why are we called the Episcopal Church? Because we couldn't call ourselves the Church of England anymore after the American Revolution. So what that means is that we have a form of governance where bishops kind of maintain the local communities that more or less map along state boundaries, but not exclusively. They're in relationship. So all these bishops in the Episcopal Church, we recognize each other. Bishop of Missouri recognizes the Bishop of Massachusetts. And we come together in our own kinds of councils. We just don't call a council usually. Maybe in Missouri, you call your DOS and gather in a council. But we have the General Convention. Which basically every 3 years we have a council where we get together and decide things. And then we cohere within the Anglican Communion, whose symbol of unity, one of them is the Archbishop of Canterbury. So the idea is that everyone who's in the Anglican Communion is in full, visible unity with what we call the See, S-E-E, of Canterbury, which means the See coming from the word sedes in Latin, the seat of Canterbury. So we have our own kind of sense of a way of relating that's based on relationship and communion, not Eucharist per se, but recognizing a mutuality of relationship between each other. But the Archbishop of Canterbury or the Anglican Communion isn't in charge of the Episcopal Church. So we emphasize this kind of mutuality of relationship. And I think that's a unique model from other kinds of Christian churches. And I threw a lot of different categories and ways of framing here. So let me see where we might want to go from there.
Well, I think you've taken us to, our roots as the Episcopal Church and where we come from by naming, after the Revolutionary War, we can no longer call ourselves the Church of England. Obviously, our roots lie within the Church of England. So perhaps explaining for our listeners You've mentioned the Archbishop of Canterbury. How does the Archbishop of Canterbury work within the Church of England, and that might help establish that kind of setting for us?
So Canterbury is the center of leadership in the Church of England. How did that happen? Basically, the mission of the Church of Rome to England in the 5th century, where Gregory the Great sends out Roman missionaries to England, or to the Anglo-Saxons, really. And they, if you look on a map, if you're going to go from Rome to England, you're going to go across France, you're going to get to the English Channel, you're going to get a boat, you're going to go across, and you're going to land in Kent, which is where Canterbury is. It's near Dover, the cliffs of Dover, right? They're like, that's why the center of the Church of England is there, is because that's the first kingdom that they got to, the kingdom of Kent. So the Church of England is in relationship then with the Church of Rome all through the medieval period, and establishes its own network of churches. The Archbishop of Canterbury then is the head of the Church of England, and basically oversees the ordination of all of the bishops in the Church of England, and creates that network of relationship. So that's why the Archbishop of Canterbury is so significant, and takes on even more significance once that break with Rome happens under Henry VIII. So as the Church of England becomes independent, the primacy of the Archbishop of Canterbury goes higher, because the importance of the Bishop of Rome has gone away.
Well, you had to name drop him, and somebody had to ask. Henry VIII and the Church of England, and I think we all know divorce.
Don't say it. Don't say
it. Too late. I'm sorry. But can you help squash this misconception about the birth of the Church of England?
That the Church of England is just because Henry VIII wanted a divorce. That Henry VIII just couldn't control his sexual desire.
That's right. Yeah.
All those things.
Mm-hmm, that's it.
Yeah. That Showtime show, I'm dating myself now, did not help us either, about the Tudors. Okay, so how do we talk about this? I mean, Colin knows, he sat through this class when I laid this all out. Henry VIII, it's really important to realize one thing about Henry VIII that is not often seen in popular culture, that he was an incredibly devout Catholic, very pious, attended Mass daily, if not more so, had a massive collection of relics. When Martin Luther comes on the scene, he basically ghostwrites a condemnation of Luther in a treatise called In Defense of the Seven Sacraments, which leads the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, to declare Henry VIII a defender of the faith. So we need to see that Henry is loyal to the church, and loyal to the church in the first decade or so of the Protestant Reformation. Henry believes a couple of other things. Like any other European monarch, he believes he is anointed by God to be the monarch of that place. So you have a tension then between Henry is loyal to the church and Henry believing in his own divine mission for England. What's one of the primary things that any good monarch needs to do is to ensure the realm is stable. How do you do that? You have a male heir. The thing to realize is that Henry VIII's father, Henry VII, becomes king and the head of the Tudor dynasty after the end of a bloody civil war that we call the War of the Roses. And so part of Henry's desire is to ensure national stability. And ensuring national stability is part of his divine responsibility. If he's not doing that, he's not doing what God sent him to do. Now, we just bracket. These are not our contemporary assumptions, but that is his worldview. Henry VIII was not supposed to be monarch. His brother Arthur was supposed to be monarch, but is killed in an accident. Arthur is married to Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. We've heard of them also. And the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V. So the Tudor dynasty, Henry VII wants to keep the marriage to Catherine of Aragon. So Henry VIII marries her as a late teenager, and she's about 27 or so. So just for all, I know you got a lot of young adult listeners there. Can you imagine being 18 and marrying a 27-year-old woman? There's gaps. There's gaps there. Okay? So just put that in your mind. They failed to produce a male heir who survives for a variety of reasons. This is really tragic. Henry comes to believe that actually he is being punished by God because there's one reading of the Hebrew Bible. It says you should not marry your brother's wife. There's another reading that says you should. That's called levirate marriage. But he comes to believe the reading that says you're cursed if you marry your brother's wife. And so he seeks an annulment based on that. So the issue for Henry really is he being a faithful Christian monarch? And if he can't produce a male heir, that's a sign of God's judgment. He needs to undertake a means to ensure that he is no longer in sin. So that's why he seeks the annulment with the Pope. The Pope denies it for a variety of reasons. A lot of it is political because, by the way, Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, Catherine's nephew, has basically surrounded the city of Rome. And so it's not a good time for the Pope to give an annulment to his antagonist's brother-in-law or uncle-in-law. That leads Henry to conclude that the Pope is in error, that the Pope is hindering his own divine mission for England. And that's where the breaking point comes then. Isn't that he just wants to marry Anne Boleyn and that he can't control his sexual desire, although that might be part of it. Like, we can't discount the other humanness of it, but we have to appreciate the religious motivations that underlie it that often get obscured. And so I'll just land on this. What Henry comes to articulate is an idea that's already circulating in that time period, which is that every Christian nation can legitimately have its own apostolically oriented church. That a Christian nation should have a Christian church, and that Christian church can lay claim to the heritage of the apostles. And so Rome is one church, and England's another church, and France is another church, etc. They all have their different apostles that they can lay claim to.
I really hope that helps just squash the big divorce bug that lives out there in the world of people's minds. But the fight continues.
Maybe I'll make a mini-series that really makes that all really compelling.
Oh, yeah. We could reach out to, one of those big media companies. We won't name drop them since they don't sponsor us.
We'll be going up against the Broadway play 6.
Yes, indeed.
Well, okay. So, thank you for doing that and going and walking us through that. Now I want to shift us back to the lens of the Episcopal Church a little bit. What are 3 things that you would hope maybe college age or young adult age range folks within our world could know more about the church, and more specifically, know about the Episcopal Church?
Mm-hmm. So the first thing I start with is that I think the gift of being Anglican, Episcopalian, is that you talk about the value of tradition within context, that you lay claim to this deep, broad Christian tradition, and that we instantiate that in a number of ways. We have our creed, we have our Eucharistic liturgy, we have our bishops. But part of the logic of actually the early English Reformation was saying, no, we have to be Christian in this way in this place. The customs and policies of Rome are appropriate for Rome. On the flip side, say they're arguing with various Calvinists in Geneva, they'll say later on, what Geneva does is appropriate for Geneva. But for England, this is what's appropriate for us. So that legacy is, I think, one of the best things about Anglicanism and the Episcopal Church is to ask, what's the best way for us to be Christian in this time and this place that allows us to be nourished by our tradition, but also be relevant and real for the place where we are? And that's what allows us to do things like revise the liturgy, change the language, look at marriage and say, maybe our understanding of marriage is different than the past, but we can also locate where it continues Christian virtue. So that's one thing. I think the second thing would just be this idea of, I think a great way of describing being Anglican and being part of the Episcopal Church is talking about in terms of Reformed Catholicity. Reformed Catholicity. That is, to build on what I was just saying, we're part of a tradition. It goes back to the apostles. Bishops are a valuable focal point for us seeing that, but we also have Catholicity in other ways, like these prayer book liturgies that we can trace back over time, the heritage of Scripture, the sense that we belong to something bigger than us. It's global in nature, and it crosses time. And we can look back to the past and ask what it means for us. But it's also reformed in the sense of saying the church can't be static. Sometimes it needs correction. Sometimes we get too inured or apathetic and let culture form us too much. And we need to take moments to look specifically at Scripture as the primary norm and to say, what does the scriptural witness call us to? That isn't to be fundamentalist, but to say the Scriptures are the foundation of what guides us to be followers of Jesus. And so if we're not always checking ourselves against that, just saying what a beautiful tradition we have, or what a beautiful liturgy we have, or what an impressive bishop we have, will cause us to miss the essential things. Yes, for a third thing, but I'm not sure I got a third thing just yet. But I'll come up with one more. But I think those two elements I'd really like to emphasize.
I'm going to take a hard left here. So we know that you are the ecumenical and interreligious relations co-officer in the Diocese of Massachusetts. So you talked about apostolic succession, and I'm wondering how full communion with our siblings in the ELCA works in terms of bishops with you. We had a brief conversation on this particular topic on another episode about full communion, but I'm wondering if we can get your hot take on it.
Yeah, so the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and us, we've been in full communion now for, I think, just about 25 years. We're coming up on the 25th anniversary. I think our documents were ratified in 1999 and 2000. In Massachusetts, we don't have a strong Lutheran presence, so it's not as strong on the ground as I think it probably is in some parts of where you all are. This was a very hot debate with the Lutherans, because some Lutheran traditions retained bishops, especially in the Scandinavian countries, but the Germanic-derived countries didn't as much. And so the idea was that whenever a Lutheran, so the ELCA did have bishops because of the Scandinavian influence, but the question was, were they bishopy enough? Like, had they lost their apostolic succession? So I just want to say one thing here. I am a magic hand skeptic. I don't think that the actual laying on of hands is what confers apostolicity. Because or that having a chart where you can go from 1 to 856 in terms of line of bishops is necessarily everything that confirms that you have apostolic succession, because the Roman Catholic Church looks at us and says, oh, you lost it somewhere. So even if you can count back, it doesn't do all of it. Or if you lay hands, it doesn't do all of it. So I think the choice that was made sense within the logic of the Episcopal Church, that this is how we establish things, by laying off hands and showing a clear line of succession. And the ELCA, I think, was gracious enough to recognize it was important to us. And so agreed that when ELCA bishops are consecrated, ordained, that the laying of hands would also be done by an Episcopal bishop to create that line of succession. I think that's actually a very mechanistic way of thinking about apostolicity. It's an important and valuable symbol. And the question is, what is the symbol teaching? And one of the ways I've come to understand apostolicity and Catholicity for myself is, does the content of the teaching tradition that's been preserved look recognizably apostolic? And do you have a means within your tradition but that you can point to say that is the thing that conveys it? In our tradition, we identify that in bishops. And I think that's actually like the best, one of the best vehicles out there for that. But I think to be truly ecumenical, to look at, say, Presbyterians, like, they don't have that, but they have other structures and ways of conveying that apostolicity. And I think when Episcopalians, we begin to look at, say, free churches like Baptists, non-denominationals, I think part of where our anxiety comes in is we're saying, where can we see and hear how you preserve Catholicity and apostolicity? If you're a Bible-only church, what's your norm for reading the Bible? There's no self-obvious way of reading the Bible. Everyone's conditioned to read Bible in some way. There's no such thing as a literal reading of the Bible, because Bible reading comes out of a communal practice. But if you insist that there is no tradition, which some free churches do, and you say that looking to the past is all about looking back at corruption and not really knowing Christ, that makes it harder to have an ecumenical relationship from within the perspective of the Episcopal Church. So that's why it's easy to get on board with ELCA folks, because they got bishops we can look at. We're going to try to work this out with Methodists who have a kind of bishop also. I was raised Methodist, so I can say that. But as you go further down the line to these more diffused structured churches, it's harder for the Episcopal Church to recognize light in those traditions. And that's where the ecumenical challenge really comes in.
So, what's your biggest hope for the Church of the heading into the 21st century? I mean, we are truly still heading into the 21st century. So,
right. Yeah. I mean, I've said this a number of different ways. I keep on thinking about, I think we are actually really in some kind of major epochal shift in our culture. We're seeing it in all kinds of ways: the rise of AI, the environmental crisis, the ways in which technology and globalization both bring us closer together, but also isolate us even more profoundly. And so that's putting enormous stresses in all kinds of things: political order, educational system, economies, and the church. So the question, my hope for the church is that at first is simply willing to name all the big changes happening and to recognize that our anxiety is about, like, are enough people coming to church? Isn't just about, are we doing evangelism right? But to ask the question, why do people feel better in not going to church? Or what's the thing that makes them feel like they can't get there? Which isn't just about, like, well, maybe they didn't read our flyer, or maybe, our Facebook ad didn't reach them. We're living in this profound culture of loneliness and isolation. So things like the opioid epidemic, for instance, speak to that profound loneliness. I think the reason why the year 2020 felt so insane was in part because of the profound isolation that COVID put on top of that. And one of my hopes for the church is to be able to find a way to speak to the profound loneliness and isolation that this culture is experiencing. And I don't think there's a magic formula. If we remember that the Episcopal Church at its best is being Christian contextually, to not be afraid to get into the local context and say, what does church need to look like here to address this profound need?
Amen to that. That's great.
Agreed. I love the idea of reimagining what church can be, and staying true to our identity as Anglicans through Richard Hooker's idea of scripture, reason, tradition. What does that look like in a space where people might not want to experience church in traditional ways in a pew, but they're willing to do it in a park somewhere.
Exactly. Pews are an early modern invention. There used to not be pews in church. So you can get rid of a pew. There used to not be a railing around an altar. You know why they put railings around an altar? Was because people gave the farm animals as offering. They put a railing up to make sure the chickens didn't go on the altar. Right? So so one of the things to keep in mind is what's essential to the tradition and what is custom. And this is what Hooker is great about. Hooker says, identify what's essential, and what's custom can be adapted as long as the removal of that custom doesn't do harm to the core teachings of the church. Right. And I think that's a really important thing. I would say, I think people want the sense of the long story that the Episcopal Church offers, that we're part of something bigger. People resonate with ritual and tradition. And I wouldn't want to see us say, well, let's just get rid of that because they don't want they don't want that. Like maybe they do. I'm a big fan of Rite One after serving in seminary where you just did Rite One a lot. And I don't do Rite One a lot because it's not done in the parish I attend. I miss it. I think there's something to be learned with just like sitting with a different kind of language and just letting it wash over you. Yeah.
That's good. That's good. Dan, thank you so much for being with us. I have one final question that I just want to put out there because you've named something and now I can't stop thinking about it. As you've named that we heading into this 21st century, and we're seeing and experiencing this epochal change, right? Has the church experienced a change? Obviously not like this with the advent of technology and everything, but massive change like this before? And if so, what can it learn from that?
Right. The Protestant Reformation itself was a massive change. It was a whole reorientation of where authority lie in the church. And it was really spurred by its own kind of technological revolutions, like the printing press, the Bible, the rise of literacy. So the Protestant Reformation was a period of profound division. It led to bloodshed, upheavals, in some ways a whole reorienting of the social system in various places. And so a couple of things is focus on the essentials, know what the core teachings are, know who Jesus is, know what Scripture says, be guided by those things. Not to be afraid of conflict. Now, you don't want to go kill your neighbor, obviously. But Judaism has this phrase, arguing for the sake of heaven. That is, you can disagree profoundly and even choose to go separate ways And that's okay if you're doing it for a higher purpose. That's more than for yourself. So being comfortable with hard decisions, I think, is an important thing that keeps the church going forward. And being aware that whatever you think you're doing might have a different outcome than you anticipate. So I like to talk about the Elizabethan settlement, where Elizabeth kind of says, we're going to hold ourselves together. We're going to orient ourselves around common prayer. Wherever you have to go to church on Sunday, you can believe wherever you want to believe, but come to church on Sunday. That worked for a while until you have the English Civil War 75 years later, 50 years later. So be aware that whatever choices we make are always contingent and conditional, that they're never permanent things, and they might lead to later choices down the road that you have to make, or that people coming after you have to make. And so never getting too attached to form. To realize that form is provisional. It's what the form holds that's necessary to stay focused on.
I think that is a wonderful thing to hear right now in the season of Lent, particularly as we begin Lent with Ash Wednesday and are reminded exactly where we are returning and how limited time, our experience of time is. That's beautiful. That's great. Claire, do you have anything that you would like to ask of Dan before we finish up?
No, I love that we just had this beautiful conversation and ended on such a beautiful note. So I'm just going to let it be.
Good. Well, it's been great being with both of you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much for being with us and spending your Thursday morning with us, and imparting some of your just a little taste of your vast knowledge that you have. And for graciously being with us. I do appreciate it. We appreciate it.
Good. Well, thank you. I hope your ministries flourish and that everything that you're doing bears good fruit.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And we will see you all, or, well, I guess we won't see you, but we will talk to you all later.
Hey, friends. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe and leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more about all things Episcopal, visit campusministry.diowestmo.org/all things Episcopal. All Things Episcopal podcast is a production of the Diocese of West Missouri in association with Resonant Media. The Lord be with you all.
Looking for fresh ideas to lead your church in today's changing world? Check out the Future Christian podcast. Each episode features pastors, authors, and faith leaders sharing practical wisdom on ministry, technology, and tackling challenges like pastoral burnout. Whether you're a pastor, church leader, or passionate about your faith, we're here to inspire and equip you for impactful ministry. Listen now on your favorite podcast platform.